Chapter 12, we're talking about the types of bias now. So we looked at all the different ways we could sample, but again, sometimes our method produces bias. So different types of bias. First one, convenience. Comes from convenience sampling. Just like when we picked the rectangles with our eye. Convenience bias, you subconsciously select certain groups of people or things. That's a convenience bias. We saw it happen with the rectangles. We actually picked a larger, on average, group of rectangles. If I'm surveying about drug or alcohol use, I might conveniently pick people and subconsciously select someone who uses or doesn't use. So you'll end up subconsciously selecting certain groups of people or things with a convenience bias, which comes from convenience sampling. Next is called voluntary response bias. Again, it comes from voluntary response sampling, but here's what we know. Usually only the strongly for or the strongly against are going to fill out some survey. If you mail a survey home, how do you like how we're doing? Usually only people that are upset at what you're doing or extremely pleased at what you're doing will mail it back in. Everyone that's just fine with how it's going won't even turn it in, so you never hear their voice. A restaurant does this all the time. They fill out comment cards, and you might get 10 cards that say, I hated the service, and people think, oh, everyone hates our service. No, the other 1,000 people that went there liked your service that day. They just didn't like it enough to fill out a comment card. So voluntary response bias comes from voluntary response sampling, and it's what happens is usually only the strongly for or the strongly against end up filling out the survey, which, by the way, is our voting system in the United States. We are purely a voluntary response voting system. The polls are open. Go to the poll if you feel like expressing your opinion on who you want. The people who are strongly for or against a candidate will go, but a lot of people are just kind of neutral, or I kind of like the candidate, or I like the even school budget voting. They just don't take the time to go. Another type of bias, under coverage. If we think about those two words, under, so not enough, coverage. So under coverage is when the method leaves out a certain group or characteristic of the population. The method that you picked left out a group or characteristic. Now, you might leave out groups all the time, and that group has nothing to do with your answer, so that's not under coverage. Like if I surveyed kids at Arcadia High School and I only asked 9th graders, do you have a pet? There's no relationship between being in 9th grade and owning a pet. So even though I asked only 9th graders, that's not under coverage. But if I asked only 9th graders, do you have a driver's license, and I wanted information about all Arcadia students, then that would be under coverage because I left out juniors and seniors and sophomores who might have a driver's license. So under coverage, when the method leaves out a certain group or characteristic of the population, the characteristic, though, impacts what you are studying. If the characteristic doesn't impact what you're studying, then it's not under coverage. Non-response bias. When people don't respond either on purpose or not, so they choose not to answer a question, it can lead to under coverage. I might walk up and say, would you like to take a survey today on drug and alcohol use? You're like, no thanks. Well, they chose not to answer, and they probably would impact our results, and therefore it led to under coverage. It comes from a non-response bias. Response bias is probably one of the most common that we have, and it's when the answer is untruthful. People do not provide a truthful answer. It could be either on purpose or not. They might be tricked by the wording of a question to answer untruthfully. Or on purpose, they just lie. So there's a few ways that this happens. Sometimes people try to please the interviewer. I might ask you, do you text while driving? And you'd say, no, when really you do. You're just trying to please me, the interviewer, and you're just going to answer no. All right, but that's a response bias. Your response itself was biased, was untruthful. Another type of response bias. The wording of the question changes the response you get. I might give you information that makes you pick a certain answer. Whether that information is true or not, I'm trying to sway your opinion with how I word the question. And if that's the case, you get response bias from wording of the question. Happened a few years back with the state voted on whether or not to put casinos in non-Native American areas. This question on the voting specifically stated, given the fact that this will generate a large amount of revenue, do you agree or disagree with putting casinos up in non-Native American areas? They didn't have to say given the fact that it generated large revenue, but because they did, because they purposely put wording in there to make you pick, oh yeah, yes, I definitely support this, they actually created a response bias situation. And the last one is some people just answer false on purpose. Happens a lot with raise your hand type responses. Hey, raise your hand if, and everyone wants to join along in the crowd. Purposefully answering falsely. So those are the most common types of bias that we have.